a rubber bulb, a brass nozzle, and a puff of white powder going down the back of a young man's open collar. That was the first thing the Army did to him. Reception station, 1955. Before the haircut, before the rifle, before he'd learned his own serial number. He was paid $83.20 a month to stand there. On a day that ran from 5 in the morning until 10 at night, that comes to about 16 cents an hour. Here's where most people get this wrong. What happened in American basic training in the 1950s wasn't cruelty, and it wasn't a conspiracy. Most of it was printed. Some of it was on a poster on the wall behind him. The question underneath it is simpler than it sounds. What are you owed before something is done to you? There was a document that answered that, signed 2 years earlier. He was never going to see it. He came in on a bus, civilian shoes, a paper bag, a folded letter telling him where to report. In January of 1955, by the Post's own count, Fort Dix in New Jersey processed 8,910 men in a single month, the largest peacetime intake in its history. 4,310 of them were draftees. The rest had signed up. Either way, the paperwork was identical. One form, one signature. That signature is the whole story, and it's worth being precise about what it did and didn't do. It made him a soldier. It did not make him a man who had to be told things. Nobody asked his opinion. Nobody read him a list. He moved down a row of tables, and at the front of that row stood a man holding something that looked like it belonged in a garden shed. The powder was DDT, 10% by weight in a talc carrier, the standard louse control issue in the United States Army, and the way you applied it was not improvised. There was a printed instruction for it, both sleeves, then 3 shots fore and 3 shots aft at the neck and at the waistband. Don't forget the head and the hat. There was even a note about setting out a chair because it saved the operator's back when there were a lot of men to get through. Picture that chair in the open air and the line waiting its turn at it. It's worth saying plainly that this varied by post and by year. Not every man who passed through American basic training in the 1950s was dusted, and the ones who were rarely thought about it twice. The powder settled into the weave of a new fatigue shirt and stayed there. It was still on him at supper. 16 cents an hour, and a chemical on his skin he could not have named. And here is where most people get this story wrong. 2 things need correcting before this goes any further. The first is the idea that the Army went soft afterward. It didn't. At Fort Jackson in South Carolina, recruits still crawl 100 meters on their bellies while machine guns fire live rounds over the top of them in the dark, with charges going off in pits beside them. It is still a requirement to graduate. The gun on the tower is a different gun now, and the safety plan around it is vastly more careful. The rounds are live in both centuries. The second correction is the bigger one. The men holding that duster were not poisoning anybody on purpose. They believed they were saving lives, and by any honest accounting they were. DDT is widely credited with preventing tens of millions of deaths from typhus and malaria in the years after the Second World War. The newspapers called it a miracle, and for a while that was close to true. So if it wasn't cruelty, what was it? Stay with me on that question. The answer isn't in anything the Army did to him. It's in a memorandum signed in Washington 2 years before he got on the bus. Subscribe if this is your kind of history. The turn is close. Start with the smallest example, because the smallest one is the one every family recognizes. In his ration box, there was a flat packet with 4 cigarettes in it, not a bonus, not something a generous sergeant handed out. A component listed on the packing slip alongside the crackers and the coffee. At the post exchange, he could buy a carton for a fraction of a day's pay, tax-free. The United States military kept cigarettes in its field rations until 1975. Hold that date against another one. The Surgeon General's report tying smoking to lung cancer landed in 1964. 11 more years of packets in boxes after the government's own doctors had put it in writing. Nobody hid the evidence. Nobody was required to act on it either. That's the pattern. And once you've seen it, you'll see it in everything else here. The information existed. The obligation to pass it along did not. There was a rule about that. There had been since 1953. On the 26th of February that year, the Secretary of Defense signed a memorandum. It adopted the Nuremberg Code, the standard written after the doctors' trials at Nuremberg, as the policy of the United States Department of Defense. It required voluntary written consent. It required that a man be told before anything was done to him the nature and the duration and the purpose of what he was agreeing to, the method by which it would be carried out, every inconvenience and hazard reasonably to be expected, and the effects on his health that might possibly come from taking part. That is a remarkable document. Here is what happened to it. It was classified. Its distribution was deliberately restricted, routed to the 3 service secretaries, copied to the Joint Chiefs, and held there. And it had been written to cover one narrow category: volunteers in experimental research on defense against atomic, biological, and chemical warfare. Training was not experimentation. Delousing was not experimentation. A ration component was not experimentation. The rule that would have required somebody to tell him existed. It was signed while he was in uniform. It had been drawn narrowly enough that it was never going to reach him. Which raises the obvious question: what was training allowed to include? On the 1st of November 1951, in the Nevada desert, several hundred American soldiers waited in trenches roughly 6 miles from a 21-kiloton nuclear detonation. When the shockwave had passed, they climbed out and advanced on foot toward Ground Zero. It was called Exercise Desert Rock 1. There were 7 in the series running through 1957. By the 5th, men were positioned 3,500 yards from the blast. At a test called Smoky in 1957, around 3,000 servicemen took part. Their protection was a film badge clipped to a pocket. Many of those badges were later damaged or lost. Now be careful here, because this is the part of the story that usually gets stretched. This was not basic training. Something like 9,000 men passed through the atomic maneuver units at Camp Desert Rock. Organized units and observer detachments, not the recruit pipeline. Your father almost certainly did not do this. What matters is that it was the same system one step further along, running under the same understanding of what a man was owed, which was nothing. Picture a 19-year-old brushing dust off his sleeve out there afterward, the way you'd brush off flour. So what did he actually get to keep? One thing, and it didn't come from basic training at all. Start with what he was taught. In September of 1957, the Army published a field manual called Train Fire. It replaced the old way of learning to shoot a paper bullseye at a known distance, scored ring by ring, the same method used on civilian ranges for decades, with something different. Silhouettes popping up on broken ground at unmarked distances, showing themselves for a few seconds and dropping. Hit or miss. No score. No way to know where the shot had actually gone. That was the quiet end of an old kind of knowledge, and it happened almost without comment. Then the other half of it. The Army also ran an office called the Director of Civilian Marksmanship, which sold surplus rifles to qualified civilians, never to the general public, only to men enrolled through affiliated clubs. One documented sale in 1958 went out the door at $102.50. Set that against his pay. more than 5 weeks of it, for a rifle he already knew how to carry. Now compare all of it to what a recruit signs today. The difference isn't toughness, it's paper. Someone arriving at an American basic training post this year will still crawl under live fire. They will still be exhausted, still shouted at, still measured against a standard set by people who do not care how tired they are. What changed sits in a folder. Before the range, there's a hearing test and issued protection, a program that traces back to 1952 when the Navy studied jet engine noise aboard a carrier, and the services finally grasped what sustained sound does to an ear. Rifles took longer. Small arms lagged behind aircraft by years because a jet runs for an hour and a rifle shot lasts a millisecond, and nobody had properly measured the second kind yet. DDT dust left the Defense Department supply system in 1965. Cigarettes left the rations in 1975. And the pay. $2,017 a month now for the lowest enlisted rank, about $66 a day, against his $2.75. One 1955 form on a table. Beside it, the stack of recruit initials today, page after page, every one of them a thing somebody is legally obliged to tell them first. Lay them side by side and the trade is legible. There is a hand pump duster in a museum collection in the United States now. Brass nozzle, rubber bulb, a canister for the powder. Behind glass, with a card beside it explaining what it was for to people who have never seen one used. Every single thing that card says, he was not told. That's the whole distance, not harsh to soft, from a thing being done to a man to a thing being explained to him first. Some of it did get accounted for eventually. The Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, the American law that pays out to on-site participants from the atmospheric tests, was reauthorized on the 4th of July, 2025, 70-odd years after the trenches, and it is still running, and the rifle is still buyable. The office that sold surplus rifles in the 50s became the Civilian Marksmanship Program, and it still ships M1 Garands to qualified American buyers. It added a straight purchase option in July of last year. The duster is in a case. The rifle is still in the mail. So tell me what your father said about basic training, and tell me the thing he never mentioned until he was much older, if he ever mentioned it at all. It's usually the second one that stays with people. Subscribe and I'll keep finding these.